Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. I'm Erin Viner, sitting in for Jonathan Hessen. Israel's finance ministry is projecting a significant slowdown in economic growth of 1 to 2% following a rapid 5% growth during the first quarter. Israel's overall estimated growth during the first half of the year, between 3.2 and 3.4%, is still healthier than many other international economies, but there's also been a slight increase in unemployment in recent months. The national deficit is rising as exports are impeded due to the strengthening shekel, whose gains against the U.S. dollar this year has made it one of the world's strongest currencies. Joining us here in the studio to discuss Israel's economic stability and the challenges that it faces are Mr. Dror Strum, who is the president of the Israeli Institute for Economic Planning, TV7 analyst Amir Oren, as always, and Professor Eytan Sheshinski, the senior fellow at the Center for Governance and the Economy. Thank you for being here. I'll start with you, Mr. Strum, because just over the past 2 days, there has been a very major development, which it's the creation of the first new bank in Israel in about 50 years. Can you please explain the significance and the ramifications of this?
Yes, the Israeli market suffers from grave concentration in many markets, one of the important of which is the finance market. We've been controlled by 5 banks, and in fact, a duopoly of 2 major banks controls more than 70% of the overall.
Which two?
Poalim and Leumi. Mm-hmm. We call them together Poalumi, but this is the nickname for this kind of duopoly. Mm-hmm. And in 49 years, we haven't had any new bank entering and competing against these 2 banks. And in recent days, after a large reform was carried out during the 2 years before that, we are now being congratulated by a new bank, which is controlled by 2 high-tech entrepreneurs.
Interesting.
Coming from Checkpoint and Mobileye, which are 2 very strong high-tech companies, and therefore we do hope that this will yield fruits of competition.
What's the new bank going to be called?
It doesn't have a name yet. It has many nicknames, but we still have 18 months to run until the emergence and the opening of the new bank, so they'll have enough time to decide that.
Let's talk now about the current political context and see what kind of an effect that's having on the Israeli economy. Are the current tensions in the Persian Gulf impacting Israel, Professor?
Well, they will. The whole world will be impacted. The Gulf, the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf, carries a large fraction of the oil supply in the world. And the tensions there and the recent events in Saudi Arabia and so forth, which reduced the oil supply
by
5%. It's a significant decrease, although President Trump said that he will fulfill this from the emergency storage of oil. So it will. And that is coupled with, of course, Iran's policy in the Middle East. So all this creates a lot of uncertainty for Israel. We're not supplied from that source, but we are affected by the world indirectly.
Do the vast underwater reserves in the Mediterranean mean that one day Israel can become energy independent?
Well, yes. I think the gas, we have about a trillion cubic meters proved reserves of gas in the deep water in Israel. And that is absolutely sufficient. Israel consumes about 20 billion cubic meters a year annually. And we're talking about exports. Israel will export. The problem for Israel is where to export and what's optimal. There are already some agreements with Egypt about liquefaction of gas. Gas can be transported, in natural form or liquefaction. Cool it and transform it into liquid. And Israel has already an agreement there.
But the benefits, are they only going to go to the owners of the companies, or is any of this going to trickle down to the Israeli consumer?
Well, the question, I think, is not whether it will be trickled, but to the extent it will be trickled. Because, of course, we have a major firm controlling these discoveries, but we do have a sovereign fund which takes a lot of the profits due to Eytan's last commission. He carried out a reform in that aspect, in taxation, and a vast part of the profits goes to the government, so the benefit will come to the citizens of Israel.
You have 2 great subject matter experts here. So I will try to be more simplistic and try to see whether Israel, and I'm exaggerating, of course, is a rich country populated by poor people. Because there is some disparity between the macro and the micro. By all economic indicators, Israel has had a fantastic run over the last 10 years or so, ever since the crisis of 2008, 2009. But many people have benefited by it. You can see the standard of living going up. But the younger generation complains that they can't get enough housing or enough money to buy housing. And strangely enough, this did not feature prominently in the last two election campaigns. Some of the politicians erroneously believed that they can appeal to voters by speaking about it, but they did not have any success. And there is some disconnect between what you hear from people and the way they behave electorally.
That's a good point. Now, Mr. Strum, as I mentioned, you are the president. Yes, certainly.
I'd like a comment about your previous question about does Israel gain Israeli citizens? And I think what you see in recent days is actually very positive development of a beginning of a competition between the. We had a monopoly. Tamar is supplying basically all the needs of Israel currently.
The Tamar underwater oil reserve.
Tamar is, is the offshore deposit there,
right,
which is currently the sole supplier to both to the electricity company and private power companies. But Leviathan is coming on, and there's some overlap of the ownership, Noble Energy and so forth, but they started competing, and the price is going down, and the papers are full with stories about how they snatch at others and take the contracts away from each other. That's a wonderful development, I think. And,
very welcome. Very welcome.
But right now, coal is still the main source of power generation, more than 60%. Down the road, of course, gas will supplant it.
Okay, so I'm going to change direction slightly. As I mentioned at the top, you are the president of the Israel Institute for Economic Planning, which is a nonprofit think tank that is dedicated to transforming the Israeli economy into a free market competitive one. I want to talk about FDI, foreign direct investment in Israel. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu postponed several votes of the Security Cabinet that were scheduled to create a mechanism that would monitor investments by other countries in Israel. And I should mention you're also the former general director of the Israel Antitrust Authority, which may play a role here. Do you believe that such a mechanism should be set up?
The short answer to that is yes. Although in competition terms, we would love to have as many players as we can afford coming to Israel, but there is a very gentle issue here because some of the new competitors coming from certain countries do not play in the same field. And if they do not play in the same field, they might be controlled by other interests which are not pure competition or pure competitive interests. So the short answer is yes, we would love to have new players, but we also need a mechanism which is genuinely and authentically governed by interest of security and as to the nature of these new players to come.
As Dror indicated, it's a very delicate issue in the Israeli-American-Chinese triangle.
Absolutely. That's exactly where we're going. You want to elaborate?
Yeah. The Chinese economy, of course, is fast growing. Perhaps will overtake the American one in 10, 12, 15 years. And Israel welcomed Chinese investments here. Many of the infrastructure projects are being built by Chinese
Let me give you some facts and figures. Exactly. Chinese imports of Israeli goods, with the exclusion of diamonds, rose 50% last year to $4.7 billion. And state-owned corporations have invested at least $20 billion in Israeli infrastructure projects, which include naval ports, tunnels, and a light rail system, which is basically leading to a big showdown between Jerusalem and Washington.
Well, there won't be a showdown because Israel will be dictated to by Washington. But the operative word which you used was state-run. And even if it's in China, but even if it's not state-run, it is controlled by the party or the state because they have to do what they are told in China. Now, you hear some strange arguments from Israelis. For instance, a very senior Navy admiral in Israel, when asked about the Chinese-built and perhaps owned port in Haifa, said, "It's fine by me. There won't be any strike there. Histadrut, the General Confederation of Labor here, is to me more of a threat than China is." However, the Americans, when they have Sixth Fleet visits in Haifa, don't want the Chinese anywhere near them.
They are very much threatening, in fact. I would like to mention that former National Security Advisor John Bolton cautioned Israel that they need to restrict Chinese investment, warning it will harm U.S.-Israeli relations. So has Energy Secretary Rick Perry when he was recently here. In June, the U.S. Senate expressed serious security concerns over China's impending control of Israel's key port.
But you're offending China at your peril.
Well, exactly. Israel's trying to balance a very tenuous line of trying to not annoy one of its strongest backers, the United States, but welcome foreign investment. But of course, the Americans are very concerned about security leaking and intelligence when it comes to the Chinese because of what you mentioned, that even when they're Chinese companies, they're still dictated to or run by the government. Does this...
The problem is that Israel doesn't really have a strategic doctrine. It improvises. And the United States, whenever a new president comes in, the new administration undergoes a very elaborate staff work, and it produces a national security document. The national security document of the Trump administration puts China and Russia as what they call peer rivals. They are peers to the United States, above North Korea, Iran, the terror organizations, and everything is keyed to that. If you are going to help China, even indirectly, you are helping our adversaries, not to say enemies. And therefore, Israel will have, in the final analysis, to do Washington's bidding rather than Beijing's.
And this is not the first time that such a thing would happen, correct?
That's true. And, you can see what happened to a giant like Huawei, that the U.S. Forbade them to compete in the U.S. market. And they are selling now off some parts. That's a tough one. We are among giants, and we better stay low.
By the way, setting up an FDI mechanism is not directly directed to China.
Not exclusively, correct?
Yes, it's like a statutory mechanism which will deal with every foreign, and the fact that we now have the Chinese, so to speak, argument raised is merely an excuse for having this mechanism which we should have been doing a long time ago.
Dozens of years ago, when the Israeli communications company Bezeq was supposed to be sold to Cable and Wireless, which is a British-run company, the government objected to the controlling share being held by any foreign entity because there are strategic concerns. It also has to do with other defense plans, which Israel wants to keep for itself, even when it wants to sell off parts of the corporation.
Which is more or less, it's similar to what happened in the year 2000 with the Falcon. When Israel wanted to send parts of the Falcon early warning system to Beijing, the warning and radar system, and the deal was, the United States at that time, if I'm not mistaken, threatened to sever $2.8 billion in aid if Israel didn't scrap the deal. And Israel did, in fact, follow through because of the U.S. pressure and ended up having to pay $350 million in compensation to China.
General Director of the Security Ministry paid with his role in this effort.
But
really? Wow.
Yes, but the problem is Israel's image in the United States of being both assisted by the United States and trying to pocket something else on the side. Not playing fair, not playing by the rules. And the Americans are fearful that whatever technology they sell or give Israel will end up at the hands of the Chinese and will be directed against them. So American soldiers will die because Israel sold American technology, even if it didn't get it directly by reverse engineering. Doesn't matter that Israel will benefit from it, and American soldiers will die, and Israel had to work for a long time to convince the Department of Defense that it is not so. It is not only the Falcon; it was also the Popeye missile,
That's right.
which is to surface.
I just want to expand on that because we have to remember that although tempting as it might be to talk only about security issues, it doesn't go only to security issues. It's about national infrastructures, for example, or national resources. For example, 10 years ago, the Canadian Potash Company wanted to acquire our salt plants in the Dead Sea, and the government refused also that. So we have a history of refusing foreign huge corporations trying to take over national infrastructure or national resources.
Now that they are building a metro system in Tel Aviv,
Right.
Yes,
there is some popular fear. It's like science fiction that because it is built by the Chinese and the controlling mechanism are going to be in Beijing, they could just switch off all transportation in Tel Aviv by a flick of the switch. That's a bit too much,
Extreme.
but it shows you that there are concerns regarding.
Well, absolutely. And not to mention the 2014 deal that China will build that cargo railway from a very critical port down by the Red Sea all across to the Mediterranean, right? That's a critical, in Ashdod and Ashkelon, 2 ports, right?
Well,
These are critical infrastructure
That's
projects.
part of the one road, one belt that the
Yes.
Chinese see the old Silk Route, and Israel has no problem with it. But some people who see the Chinese competing with the Americans for the first place in the world, for top place, are fearful that even though it looks right now, it looks benevolent, it will turn up to be quite malign.
When we're talking about the FDI mechanism, Prime Minister Netanyahu entrusted the National Security Advisor, Meir Ben Shabbat, with coming up with a proposal after consultations with the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, and officials from, which I think is interesting, with officials from the finance and the foreign ministries. What do we know, if anything, about this plan?
I certainly am not one who knows what happened there. I haven't heard of any.
It was just an exercise in futility in order to put it off until after the elections and give some pretext to Washington why there is no response yet. There is nothing of substance yet in these consultations.
Go ahead.
Allow me also on the various strategic sector. Also, in the past, in the financial sector, Israel was reluctant to allow them to enter into the pension market or the stock market.
companies.
Again, insurance. These are all sectors which have economy-wide effects if they fail and so forth. And I think Israel is sensitive for a good reason.
Has the recent political turmoil that's been going on, the fact that we've had a caretaker government, 2 elections historically, and there's always the possibility of a third one, although no one wants to think about it. Has that had any effect on investor confidence in Israel, or any other effect on the economy?
It's the best government we ever had. It didn't,
No government.
It did nothing. There was
Nothing
there
harmful.
was yes, no mistake, no investment which failed. It can go on like that.
May I mention a joke? Some years ago, the Jewish Agency, people questioned the necessity of it's something pre-state institution.
Like a government.
And I suggested a plan. Close the Jewish Agency for 1 month. If you don't hear any cries and so forth, continue for 1 more month. And so continue on, and that's it.
When I was a public official, I remember we used to have another joke that when ministers are on the run for elections, this is the best time to create and pass reforms. So, and indeed it worked.
It's wise indeed.
That's
Yeah,
yes
it really
minister
is.
material,
Yes,
right?
yes. But it works, you know.
Well, on a serious note, how concerned should we be about the government deficit in Israel, which we talked about at the beginning, which at the close of last year amounted to $220.5 billion, which reflected a rise of 5.5% over 2017.
It's only money, Erin.
So you're not concerned. Well, we as journalists, we were saying see very little money, but our
220 billion,
economists,
trillion, what do we care?
are you concerned?
Well, I'm a bit concerned, not because we have an enlarged deficit. That happens. In fact, we used to have that, I think, back in 2014 and 2000.
Right now it's at 10.8 billion, the
No,
deficit,
but if I
the budget
remember
deficit.
correctly,
right?
we always talk along years. And the long years, we are maintaining the same level, so to speak, for 5 or 7 years. So I'm not worried about the fact that we enlarged the deficit. I'm worried about the reasons for that. Because as I see it, the reasons for enlarging the deficit were not on the account of building something new, of enlarging and growing our markets, but rather paying some sectors pre-election presence. And that's worrying because it brings us back to other decades.
There is no coherent policy because, for instance, if the government wants to break away, not Israel, but the world, from the nuclear deal with Iran.
Yes.
Prime Minister Netanyahu made a lot of effort persuading the Trump administration to undercut whatever President Obama and the other parties to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action did. If this is the Israeli policy, then it has certain repercussions. And one has to translate it into a bigger defense budget, which the Israeli military didn't want up until that time. The Israeli military finally got into the right cycle of planning, programming, budgeting, and now it's in turmoil. But if you do add to the defense budget, you cannot add to the welfare or infrastructure accounts, and it's out of joint. Now, if there is a so-called national unity government emerging out of the election, perhaps they will be able to agree on a sensible economic and security policy. The peace dividend is going to be paid in dividends too, not only in tranquility and less bloodshed, but it will also have an economic result, a favorite one.
In fact, you're leading, go ahead, would you like to say something? You're leading directly where I'd like to go next, which is, Professor, what do you believe will be the main challenges facing the next Ministry of Finance once a government is sworn in?
Well, you already mentioned the deficit will have to be taken care of.
How?
And well, most people think that some raise in taxes will be needed.
That seems like such a catch-all answer.
Well, okay, that's a catch-all. You have to do it. But on the other hand, the across the board,
Right.
cutting across the board is also not an optimal policy. So as was said here, a national unity government, which is stable and has an absolute majority, doesn't depend on a small number of Knesset members, may be able to carry through reforms which are needed. But the main thing is the infrastructure, the financial market reforms, the financial markets, electricity, natural resources which are coming on, and so forth. This is what the new government will have to do. Pension issues, life expectancy, adequacy of welfare payments, and so forth, will depend quite a bit about the structure of the new government. Will it be more welfare-oriented and so forth?
Let me elaborate on something that Professor Sheshinski said. He said
Absolutely.
life expectancy. Israel is number 10 on the global list of life expectancy, and many of those preceding it on the list are places like Monaco, Hong Kong, Singapore. Of the really developed countries, only Japan, which is number 2 on the list, is ahead of Israel.
And to what do you attribute that?
Life is fine here. Great weather, beautiful women, and women live to 84.
Incidentally, I saw a study, 87% of elderly Israelis find their lives very satisfying. That was just
Yes,
taken a few
but
days
That's
ago.
a huge
But-
rate.
It's interesting. It's a huge number.
But the upshot, as Eytan mentioned, is that you must have more pensions for a longer time. And the burden on the younger generation is greater. statistically, every Israeli born this year will live to see the 22nd century. Because life expectancy is almost 83 years old. Add
That's right.
82.7 to 2019, you are there.
See, you are an economist. You are good with numbers.
The
No,
question
no,
is,
I plan on being there and look at the predictions the economists made and see whether they were right.
I wonder if that's a blessing to live up to the next century.
Well, you know that it's not, and the experts are saying that it is not life expectancy which has been lengthened, only old age.
Well,
Mr. Strum, do you have anything to add to that? What do you think?
Well, I'd like to add 2 points, in fact.
Sure.
The first is a point which refers to back to what Amir said earlier, and that is the tension between the rate of Israel in competitiveness and so on, and the life quality here. And I think we have to remember that Israel is in a very long process of turning from a very concentrated government controlled market to free market. And I think that's influenced because we have so many monopolies in many markets. So that's why the cost of living in Israel is relatively high, which is a very inclusive burden to the young generation. But looking at the process, I think that we are seeing results of greater competition. And in some sectors, as ICT, telecom, financial markets, we see lower prices. So we do have hope for younger generation, and that's important.
But income distribution should be improved.
Right.
20% of Israelis are below the poverty line. So life is good for those who can afford it. But for many Israelis, life is not yet good enough.
But we are
Which
seeing.
brings me to the second
Yes,
point I wanted to
please.
refer to is, and that goes to the nature of the Israeli society. I think the Israeli society is built on solidarity. Our main asset in surviving all these harsh years was solidarity. And I think that what we are seeing in economy is the split off of this solidarity between different stages, different compromises of the society, and the crunches between these sectors. I think this is the main challenge of many governments.
I'm sorry to say that we're out of time, but what a good note to end on. Mr. Dror Strum, thank you so much for being our guest. TV7 analyst Amir Oren and Professor Eytan Sheshinski, thank you for being our guest. And I'd like to thank our TV7 audience at home. I'm Erin Viner, wishing you a wonderful evening. See you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.